Hello and welcome to this very live stream brought to you by the Y Club. I'm your host Matt for today, and I'll be talking about a very important topic: why people like Trump get elected. In order to understand that, we'll take a look at what populism is, what a liberal democracy is, and why populism is growing in comparison, and what the left can do about it, or really anybody who wants to live in a liberal democracy instead of a more authoritarian version of governance. So with that in mind, I brought the first video just to take a look at Trump's rhetoric overall about how he positions himself as the leader of the people instead of just, an average Joe, really just representing the elites.
Every day, I wake up determined to deliver a better life for the people all across this nation that have been ignored, neglected, and abandoned. I have visited the laid-off factory workers and the communities crushed by our horrible and unfair trade deals. These are the forgotten men and women of our country, and they are forgotten, but they're not going to be forgotten long.
So step one right off the bat, very important to just take a look at what he's talking about. He positions himself as the voice of the people. This is going to be the very first principle on which populism rests. And I went ahead and sort of started drawing out the questions that we need to tackle in today's live stream in order to start understanding things. So the question is really, why populists win? And then during that time, we need to answer what a liberal democracy is, what a populism means, why is populism growing, obviously why this conversation is important to be had to begin with, and what can be done about it, really. So right off the bat, the reason I showed the video is exactly to showcase what Trump is about, which is sort of pitting the average people in America against a perceived or realistic, I would argue, I think that's very realistic to say, against a financial and political elite. And this is what Trump is doing as a populist. This is the same in Orban's Hungary, or this was the case with Kaczynski's Poland. And this is also something we see, for example, in Germany with the AfD, and today is going to be the elections in Germany as well. So a strongman leader, such as Trump, representing the true voice of the people. Back in Nazi Germany, this was "Wir sind der Volk," I think, which meant we are the people. So this is step one to populism. The way this rhetoric works is by sort of oversimplifying complex problems. The reason for that oversimplification is because, as we've seen in the past, the political elites, left in particular, used a sort of language that was most of the time uninteresting to the average voters. And they didn't really speak the language of the people. And so by oversimplifying these complex problems, the strongmen can represent themselves as really just a person coming from the average population, where the world is bad, and it's bad because the elites are corrupt and working for outside interests. This is super important, and we saw it with Trump's rhetoric just outside, his rallies as well, when he was talking, for example, how Goldman Sachs had total control over Hillary Clinton, and actually stacked his own team with Goldman insiders. So, for example, last time I uploaded this live stream, somebody commented that I have it completely wrong, and Donald Trump was elected with the promise of sort of dismantling the oligarchy. Instead, what we got is that he sort of started building out his own oligarchy with Republicans and the people who appeal to him or are on the same side as him. And so he's using very much the rhetoric when it's convenient against his political opponents, while claiming the same benefits that they claimed, from lobbyists, from the interest groups Trump is aligned with. And the same ridiculous claims emanate from this kind of rhetoric relating to, for example, when they started questioning whether Obama was truly American or whether he was a Muslim or he was born in Kenya. So these ridiculous claims are there to sort of, start questioning whether things are really as complex or whether things do seem what they seem like, or is it something else? So with that in mind, I think it's super important to track this kind of rhetoric and understand that populists all around the world are using this kind of rhetoric to oversimplify complex problems while claiming to represent the voice of the true people. It is sort of an ethical and moral superiority when talking against the people on the opposition. That's why Trump, that's why other populists dare to use the kind of language to dismantle the opposition and their talking points and attack them personally. And the third part here is that it's about dismantling liberal institutions, and we'll talk about that, how Trump is doing that in America. So in comparison to, let me just check something, sorry. Okay, so back to the topic. In comparison to liberal democracies, Trump is now working on dismantling the liberal parts of democracy, which are critical media outlets versus the loyalist media, the judicial branch, NGOs, foundations, agencies, trade unions, think tanks, everything. The reason being is that just as in Orban's Hungary, for example, who I think in 2016 claimed that he's building an illiberal democracy, Trump and other populists see these liberal institutions, liberal in the sense of working toward free and fair elections, toward rule of law, equality, justice, not necessarily in progressive liberal terms, but really in the original sense of liberalism. So they're working against that, claiming that these institutions stop or halt the progression of the voices of the true people. So by dismantling the critical media, Trump banned AP, for example, from the White House, claiming that it's a privilege to speak there. So this is one step of dismantling this liberal institution. Look at the judicial branch. Activist judges are now being labeled as treasonous and being against the executive branch, and hence being anti-democratic, meaning that they're working against what the people want because the people elected Trump, who is here to represent them and do things for them. But the judicial branch is in this sense opposing and stopping Trump from executing his agenda, which in a way can be looked at as undemocratic, and we'll talk about that. NGOs, foundations, agencies, anybody who could help uphold civil liberties are also under attack. Very likely with limiting foreign funding to weaken them financially. This is the case in Hungary, this was the case in Poland, and this could be the case in the US as well. So very easily, the way to look at this rhetoric is really everybody who is not with the people and is against the general populace is against the establishment, against the will of the people, and therefore are part of that international conspiracy, the true interest groups, or really the people who are against that particular country. With regards to being, interestingly, so here there is an interesting part of populism. So while it is illiberal in its primary driver, it is democratic in the beginning, namely that the will of the people, really how people want to be governed by themselves, can be executed better than in an undemocratic liberalism. And we'll talk about what that means in a bit. But basically what Trump is claiming, in the sense that this is more democratic because the people get what they wanted, is being executed better, which is a very interesting thing to actually see come through in life. In order to understand a little better, I want to take a look at what a liberal democracy is And by the way, the book on which I'm sort of putting this analysis out is Yascha Mounk's People versus Democracy. Highly recommended read. It does this in depth, what I'm doing in a live stream, and probably has a better way of explaining these terms, how they came about, and what they mean. But I would say in a live stream, I'll do my best to expand on this. So with regards to liberal democracy, the way Yascha Mounk is breaking it down, that you can either have like the liberal part and the democratic part of a liberal democracy at times is conflicting with one another. And this way, you can build illiberal democracies, which, for example, is Hungary, or what Trump is working on, where the will of the people is represented more, yet in an illiberal way to sort of throttle dissenting voices, for example, coming from the media, judicial branches, NGOs, and the likes. And on the other end, there is a liberal on democracy, where the liberal institutions are upheld to a certain degree, but it is undemocratic in a way, such as, for example, the European Union. What do we mean by that? In this case, you have a conflict between representative democracy versus these unelected tutelary institutions or auxiliary institutions, such as bureaucracy. Elon talked about this very briefly on one of the White House addresses when he was telling that the bureaucracy is unconstitutional. The bureaucracy is not unconstitutional, but is not necessarily democratic, meaning that the bureaucracy, to a certain degree, is going to interpret the law in their own way to make up rules, to sort of confine their work within the law that is legislated by Congress, for example. And this bureaucracy halts the ability of people to have their will come through. We see this with environmental agencies like the EPA in the US, but also with supranational bodies like the WHO, the UN, NATO. These are all organizations that people didn't vote into existence. They are like coming from a long line of delegation from elected or unelected officials. But we also see that by nature, they're not necessarily part of a grand conspiracy to sort of silence the will of the people. Rather, they're reactionary. They are answering a valid need in the world, namely, for example, WHO. Countries in themselves have little ability to address problems such as world hunger or worldwide vaccination, stopping epidemics, and so on. Which means that we need supranational bodies to regulate this. And it also requires a lot of expertise, technical expertise in a certain domain that most people, the large majority of the populace, does not have. So bureaucracy, while being undemocratic, is an important part to sort of start looking at the interests that are beyond the state and beyond the immediate needs of people, but are in the long-term sustainability goals of the world as a whole. So this is a big problem, for example, in the illiberal part, when Trump is exiting the WHO, the Paris Agreement, and so on. So this means that it's getting more democratic, but it will lose some of the benefits of long-term sustainability. To give an example, the central banks are a good example of why unelected powers within the hands of people who don't have a close vested interest like the people would have works well. So the benefits, dependent central banks would typically boost inflation in the short run without sustainably decreasing unemployment in the long run. Making central banks independent puts decisions about interest rates in the hands of people who are insulated from such short-term incentives, thereby boosting long-term economic performance. Basically what it means is that with the central banks, such as in Europe, where we have a European central bank, we already did the study and the research on what is the best way for our democracies to move forward with a fiscal or monetary policy. And we found that whereas we could organize central banks in a dependent way, where they're dependent on the central government, they produce better economic long-term outcomes if they're organized as independent entities. But obviously the problem arises, what we saw from, let's say, 2008, the financial crisis, is in case something goes wrong, how will they be held accountable? And this is a real problem, and this also just further makes it into a problem of not being too democratic. The will of the people will not be pushed forth when it comes to that. So this is step one of how, for example, the European Union is undemocratic in comparison to a fully liberal democracy. The other part of it, which is interesting, and we're going to talk about this in detail in a bit, is about how the representatives in liberal undemocracies are losing connection with the constituents they are actually supposed to represent. And Michael Sandel, who is a political theorist in the US, has a great analogy as in the skybar analogy. Namely, I just want to stop the music for a second. So the skybar analogy goes that back in the 50s, back in the 60s, during baseball matches, the people with affluency, people who had more money or were more part of the higher class, let's say, used to sit in the same skybars as the people who were not really rich or couldn't really afford too much in their everyday lives. Yet the prices in the baseball match tickets with regards to the skybar or just the average places to sit wasn't too big, meaning that at times even the poorer families could afford to sit in the more prestigious places together with a wide variety of higher class people. But in 2025, this is not so anymore. People sitting in the front often don't experience the same things during a game as the people who are sitting above them in a skybar. There's different food, they have to stand in lines, and they often are the first ones to experience when the rain is coming down. So that means that throughout the years, throughout the decades, there was a big shift from a perspective of equality in financial terms to where we are today. Meaning that the skybar analogy shows how the representatives of democracy, among other things, started losing connection to the voter base they ought to represent. And one other example is how in the general populace in the US, 1 out of 200 people hold a law degree, whereas in Congress, 1 in 3 people hold a degree in law, which is just a cherry-picked data. I do know that. But what it means is that the people in their own echo chambers or in their own bubbles are very different from their constituents. Let's go forward with the judicial review. Since the fall of the Second World War, most countries, or like a lot of different countries, introduced judicial review, and the judicial branch got to more and more power, which meant that it was done in a way that was detrimental to the executive powers. It meant that the abuses of the executive branch were under review from the judicial branch. Is this democratic in that way? In the US, this comes from a direct line of delegation from the US president when it comes to the SCOTUS, for example. And most judges in the states are not going to be elected, or like judges in general are not going to be elected by the general populace. Is this helpful while being undemocratic? Of course. Why is it so? Because throughout history, in the US, for example, without the judicial review and without the SCOTUS, for example, the US wouldn't have dismantled segregation. It wouldn't have limited censorship, wouldn't have decriminalized homosexuality, and instituted same-sex marriage, for example. So we see that the judicial branch and the judicial review, while in principle undemocratic, is very much liberal because it protects the rights of minorities even when they are minorities. So I think that is quite important. Let me check where things are here. I see that I'm not showing the other screen. I just realized that. Okay. Well, no problem. So going forward from the judicial review, what we see is that, what if I just close this? I see for some reason my screen is not showing the way I want it to show. Which is a problem. There we go. Okay, much better. Sorry, I just realized that. So, as I was talking about the judicial review here, we see that it is unelected. But one of the problems, for example, with the judicial review is that it can be reverted. Meaning that in case, let's say with regards to abortion, Wade versus Roe was turned around. And that means that it's not only undemocratic, but it can depend heavily on like how, for example, SCOTUS is made up of, which is a big part of the problems because it's either going to be democratic and represent the will of the people or going to be undemocratic and it can be balanced either way. In terms of overall the judicial review, I think that's pretty much enough of that. The fourth part here is international treaties and organizations. Obviously, most people in democracies are not experts on interstate commerce and can think rightfully that the kind of global elites are controlling areas of their life, which is not beneficial for them. And in a way, they are true because we saw with the growing inequalities throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on, that a small minority, a small fraction of people benefit mostly from global trade and mostly from the economic growth as well. But we saw also that from the 1960s to 2000, the percentage of the GDP bound in foreign trade doubled, which means that it is a big part that individuals by themselves will not be able to negotiate, and international treaties and organizations will have to be in place in order to regulate that properly. The sort of quality of life we enjoy in the West is in large due to, at least partially, due to these organizations having a firm grip on negotiating international treaties and negotiations. And there is a fifth element of the undemocratic elements of liberal undemocracy, such as the European Union, which is lobbying, which is also a big part of the US. So there was a theory or like a study devised, which wanted to take a look at 4 different possibilities of who's ruling the country. And the first one was obviously average people. You go to the voting booth, you give your votes, and based on that, the person who gets elected is going to represent you. So potentially, you should have a lot of say in what happens with the country. The second option was the economic elite, people who represent large corporations or larger economic interest groups. Then there were the mass-based interest groups and the narrow interest groups. What came out from this study, and I think it's linked, or I can link it later, is that the economic elites dominate most of the time, together with narrow interest groups. So, people advocating for more oil extraction, more gas extraction, new pipelines, less infrastructure, less social welfare, more tax cuts. This doesn't really have to do with the average people, no matter who you're voting into power. which is a big problem because this is one of the most undemocratic parts, and we're going to talk about how that impacts most people's lives, and I'll show you a video here. Ironically, with regards to money, there was a very famous case with Citizens United, after which the SCOTUS ruled that campaign financing is a form of political speech, and as most free speech absolutionists argued that abolishing the ability to give contributions, financial contributions to elections would be undemocratic and illiberal also. Sorry, not undemocratic, illiberal, because it would impede your right to free speech. And so after this, I think it was in 2012, 2010 or so, now the dollar contributions are much, much higher than ever. And what's really interesting here as a number from the book is that every dollar spent on lobbying by labor unions or public interest groups, large corporations and associations spend $34 more, so 34 times more than groups lobbying for the average people, which is just a lot. And this is, I think, a very interesting part, which, if I'm not mistaken, Lawrence Lessig coined the dependence corruption. Sort of in a way, yeah, let's just take a look at the video where it was on Joe Rogan, which was very funny. It was 6 years ago.
How much of the time they spend is involved in raising money, and why?
Yeah, so we've got a system where we have a money primary, and then we have a regular election. And in the money primary, to compete, you got to raise tons of money to be able to fund your campaign. And when you raise that money, you raise it from a tiny, tiny fraction of the 1%. So in the TED Talk about Lesterland, I said, imagine a place called Lesterland, where basically it's the Lesters who rule. And by the Lesters, I mean the same proportion of people named Lester as in the United States right now. So there's about 150,000 Americans named Lester. I'm one of them. But here we are, the Lesters. So imagine a world ruled by Lesterland. Because that's essentially the world we have because of the way we fund our campaigns. Because there's about 150,000 men who give even just a maximum contribution to one political candidate. If you ask the number of people who give the maximum contribution over the course of a campaign, meaning in the primary and the general election, it's about 22,000 Americans.
So yeah, that is crazy. Basically what this means is that a very small proportion of people control what the American politics should look like. And this is the same in the European Union, to be fair. This means, like, if I'm not mistaken, also in the book, it is mentioned that while during the 80s or so, it was about less than 1,000 registered lobbyists in the European Union. By today, we have about 30,000 or so, which just shows the scale by which this lobbyism grew. And yeah, there will be a lot of people who would argue that lobbying is not a form of corruption, and legally they would be right, especially after Citizens United. But it also is a softer form, or could be looked at as a softer form of corruption for a variety of reasons. First of all, the number of hours a day a politician will spend to raise funds is about 30 to 70% of their total time. And you can check the video again with Lawrence Lessig. He's talking there in more detail. But it means that the majority of politicians' work is about finding funds for their next election campaigns. And this is a big problem because that means that they're not spending that time representing the people, working on meaningful policy, but rather talking with the people who, in some ways, call the shots. And so that's not only that, but by spending so much time with these people, lobbyists and politicians together, so the politicians and the representatives are losing even more connection with the constituents, meaning that they spend more and more time in an echo chamber where they're surrounded by lobbyists, where they're surrounded by these domain-specific experts talking about some policy favoring them in some way rather than others. And that becomes the new norm for them. So it's a psychological distortion and a bias that you will build over time towards those on whom you are dependent. And this is one of the reasons I think Trump is a very big contradiction in terms of draining the swamp versus what really gets drained. As pointed out in my last live stream's comment, Trump was elected to get rid of the oligarchy. But what Trump really is doing is not that, at least not the entire swamp, but rather the Republican part of it will be kept while potentially throwing out or trying to throw out the Democratic part. But it's not going to happen. The reason it's not going to happen is because Trump is likely not going to change the lobbying laws, or is not going to push for policies to change that and sort of take money out of politics. If anything, probably he would add even more to that. That is number one. And the second is going to have to do with the taxes. So what Trump is promising is making America great again. And I'll talk about this very briefly, but I think it's just worth taking a look at that part of the economy here. Yeah, so Trump wants to go back to a time in America where things were better without increasing the taxes. Like, I do know that Trump hates increasing taxes. So Trump wants the benefits of, let's say, the 70s or the 80s or even the 60s, where, Reagan, for example, slashed the top tax rate for high-income earners from 70% to 50%, and then to 35% or 38.5%, and then Bush cut more tax, and then Trump in 2017, one of his big projects was the TCGA, where he cut even more taxes. So without providing the same level of welfare, how are you going to make America great again? And Trump doesn't really seem to have an answer to that. Obviously, with Doge, they're talking about government efficiency, but they're not going to find as much efficiency. And also, what they're most of the time calling fraud and abuse is not really fraud and abuse, but spending motivated by a different ideology. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. It just means it's not necessarily fraud for that particular reason. So one of the big reasons why I think Trump is not going to drain the swamp, Trump is not going to not only bring down the oligarchy, but rather build a bigger oligarchy, is because of the tax cuts and because of the lobbying schemes. So these parts are the undemocratic parts of liberal democracies. And we see liberal democracy, which I briefly mentioned here, about how populists typically dismantle liberal institutions through dismantling the media, the judicial branch, NGOs, foundations, everybody really who's opposing the popular will. So overall, we tackled what populism is. We looked at what parts of liberal democracies are either illiberal or undemocratic. And now I think the way we can go forward a little is take a look at the backgrounds and the origins and ask ourselves, why is populism growing? And in the book, once again, I'm talking about Yascha Mounk's People versus Democracy. He's referring to this, and most political theorists are referring to this as democratic deconsolidation. What does that mean? It means a few different things. So to understand the opposite of that, which is democratic consolidation, we need to take a look at what happened after the Second World War. So after the Second World War, most European countries, the US, started to consolidate democracies more and more. It was built on a monoethnic culture, meaning that especially after the Second World War, especially in Europe, countries more or less were homogenous in ethnicity and their culture, religion, and so on, which was a fertile ground for building something consolidated. The second was economic growth. it meant that for a large number of decades, the people in these democracies didn't have to compete for resources. They could coexist and collaborate for more gains for everybody. It didn't necessarily mean that everybody got the same share of the wealth that was generated, but that people more or less generated more wealth for themselves as the generations before. This is called absolute social mobility or economic mobility. But we see that in recent years that we're entering a phase of deconsolidation. What does that mean? It means that people are falling out of love with democracy across the world. People are open to alternatives such as illiberal democracies or other authoritarian forms of regimes and government. That we have a large shift in public discourse from the previous adversaries in politics to now enemies in politics. And I think one of the great examples of this is when John McCain was asked by a voter, or like a voter was telling McCain that he was anxious about Obama.
We're scared. We're scared of an Obama presidency, and I'll tell you why. I'm concerned about someone that cohorts with domestic terrorists such as heirs.
I have to tell you, he is a decent person and a person that you do not have to be scared as President of the United States. Now, look, I
got to ask you a question. I do not I can't trust Obama. I have read about him, and he's an Arab. He is not. No?
No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is all about. He's not. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a weird time of reason, and just decency overall in political discourse. When the lady's telling McCain that she's afraid because Obama is an Arab, which is not true. It's crazy. Yeah, it was like this was pushed in the narratives later by Trump that he was born in Kenya, but it's not true. He was born in Hawaii. And at this time, still, McCain and just in general, public discourse was decent enough so that even political adversaries didn't look at each other as enemies. But nowadays, it shifted, as we see. Most of what Trump is talking about, and mostly how the left is viewing Trump right now is the same. So it was a big shift. And that appeals to a lot of new people who have been disenfranchised by the current, or like the status quo, who feel disappointed, disillusioned in what liberal democracies stand for, and they resonate with the message of, yeah, these people are our enemies, and this is a person who finally represents me. There's an additional layer to that, meaning that young people, my generation and the generation potentially before me, millennials, forgot what the past looks like. Mostly, we enjoyed benefits and privileges for our lives and that we have taken for granted, for which our grandparents and their parents fought for and died over. So these privileges are not something that we recognize as fruits of liberal democracies. There is a very different element here, which is the media part for the democratic deconsolidation. Namely, that the legacy media lost control of narratives. This is still going on, actually. And with social media and with the rise of social media, which was at that time seen as a liberating technology, and most of the time, technology and innovation is rather a liberating force than an oppressive one. It doesn't mean it's not going to be used for oppressive means, but it means that originally, the people who will use it to their best most of the time are the rebels, which unfortunately, in authoritarian regimes, mean more freedom for the people who are organizing protests, who are trying to bring down the establishment and a dictatorship, probably. But then they will also catch up on this, and they will utilize social media as a different kind of tool to break down dissent, to imprison people, to spy on others, and to imprison people who are on the opposition. And what's interesting as well, that while these tools could be used as a liberating force still, the way they are structured and the way they are built up structurally is with a different motivation. It is to maximize engagement, to maximize profits. And having built these algorithms that utilize a very specific way of filtering information is undermining whether those tools can actually be used as liberating forces. And this is a video. This guy is Tim Kendall, who was the former head of monetization at Facebook, talking about how the algorithm is amplifying, dividing voices and amplifying things that will lead to more engagement.
Its users, and how pervasive is the addiction?
Well, it really just boils down to the business model, right? The business model is advertising based. And when you have an advertising based business model, your objective is to get more people to pay attention to your product and to pay attention longer each and every day. And so what's happened is you basically have an advertising business model that's combined with just ever growing, ever more intelligent.
Yeah, and I think it's important to take this seriously with Mark Zuckerberg's recent rebranding, or the rebranding that goes on for this tech bro image that he's sort of emanating, just to not forget where he came from. And the way Tim Kendall sort of used an analogy to how social media works is likening it to tobacco. So tobacco companies, with their initial product, they sought to make it more and more addictive by adding menthol, by adding sugar, and so just making sure that the product can be enjoyed for longer, really pushing for an addictive nature.
Technology, and that combination is really potent, and what it's leading to is a product that's just fundamentally addictive for people, and it's causing all kinds of mental health issues, and I think it's eroding aspects of society. I mean, you just saw in your last segment, I mean, all this division and polarization that's happening along racial dimensions, along political dimensions, along conspiracy theories, around health dimensions like COVID-19, all that polarization, I believe, is getting exacerbated by the algorithms that are powering these companies. And these algorithms are designed to drive more engagement. And the reason they're designed solely to optimize for that is that's how the business model works. They make money the more time we spend.
And the important notion here and the consequences of that algorithm working this way is, for example, we could talk about COVID-19, for example, but I think one very well isolated case was the violence against the Rohingya in Myanmar. That was caused partially by the engagement algorithm promoting content inciting for violence against a religious minority in Myanmar that led to the death, I think, of a couple 100,000 people. Yeah, it's a lot of people. And Meta, if I'm not mistaken, have not been held accountable for this, enabling this basically. And obviously, they commissioned a human rights impact report. They admitted the company was not doing enough to stop the sowing of hatred against the Rohingya. I'll just make it bigger as well. But, I mean, is this really enough? I don't think so. So if you have this much power in the world, which is definitely unelected, the way we're using the tools have little to do with how the tools were supposed to work rather than how they were designed for profits and market conditions. So with that in mind, I think and for example, in the case of Trump and the Populist, the social media is used as a tool for attacking the opposition, for attacking truth. And this is what I see personally with Twitter. This is what I think will happen with Facebook even more. And it's a dire future that could be realized that could play more to the hands of populists. So overall, social media serves most of the time the newcomers, the rebels who are gaining ground against the status quo. And what also contributed big time to the deconsolidation of democracies is struggling economies. As I already pointed out here with regards to the tax rate and everything, the inequalities have been growing. While from 1935 to 1960, and then once again to 1985, the living standards throughout these two 25-year periods doubled in each case. Since 1985 in the US and also in some democracies in Europe, since then have been flat. And while at that time, a larger proportion of the wealth went to the bottom 90% of the people, in 2012, and I would love to see, probably there is new data on this, in 2012, already 42% of the total wealth growth went to the top 0.1%, which is just enormous. It's something that most people cannot comprehend. There is no meaningful analogy to show that difference between like how much you're gaining from the growth versus how much the people on top are gaining from the growth. And what it meant actually that whereas with a GDP growth of 4% every single year, these countries allowed for people to enjoy the fruits of their labor. As these resources started to tighten up, the competition again started to grow. And this will tie into why the fear of immigration became such a big priority, for example, why the identity of the previously monoethnic nation got jeopardized, and how it fuels now economic anxieties and also racial tensions in Europe, throughout the US, and really everywhere where populists are around. Very funny, I just read browsing Bill Gates talking about that young people have 4 major global threats to worry about, which is, thank you, Bill. And in it, he talks about AI being one of them. I think he talks about healthcare, but he's also saying that we could enjoy a better life without Alzheimer's, which is a nice to have for sure, but doesn't necessarily answer most of the questions that we have, for example, regarding AI. So this is just adding to that. But the major conclusion from the book was that the people voting for populists are not necessarily the people who at this moment are in the worst of conditions. There is a false narrative, and there was a false narrative throughout the election periods that the people, Trump supporters, are worse off than the constituents of Democrats. This is not true. They have higher household income, for example. I think the unemployment rate is also lower than that of the voter base for the Democrats. But we also see that they're less educated, less likely to hold a degree or like a college degree, have less professional jobs, and they have worse health outcomes, lower social mobility, less social capital. Which means that, or like one of the potential explanations for that is that it's not the economic realities today that shape voter sentiment toward candidates, but rather the predicted anxieties or the fears of the future, basically. So it's not necessarily that I'm doing horribly right now, but the future that I see in front of me is one where I have much less say in what's going to happen, and I'm much more fearful about what's going to happen, and I don't have much say to it. So there's that about struggling economies. The last part, which I think is super important, is the national identity versus immigration, and the narrative overall around sovereignty versus being part of a global economy and interstate and international commerce and all those. So, as I already mentioned, European democracies, especially, were founded on monoethnic nations. Interestingly enough, in the US, this has not been the case. The US has been a much more diverse democracy to begin with, but racial equality was not something that was too widespread, and it's still not 100% done in a way that is going to produce equal opportunities for different racial groups. But what I wanted to say is that founded in monoethnic nations, these countries, when having struggling economies, have been able to grow this kind of fear of immigration and pitting the people against the newcomers because they have to compete for more resources. Therefore, the narrative, for example, that the immigrants are taking our jobs in a given country became so popular because people felt sort of as a correlation between their lowering upward social mobility and the incoming wave of immigrants. They sort of made the connection that the cause of my problems is the immigration, is the immigrant from Mexico, from Guatemala, who's taking my jobs, and therefore I'm not able to earn as well. And this is one of the ways, for example, how populists are oversimplifying complex problems. They will claim that this is exactly the case. The reason you don't have a job right now, or the reason you feel so much anxiety about the future, is because there are these foreigners here who are taking away your opportunities, where in reality, we see that one of the cases and one of the reasons for this huge inequality is, for example, the lack of taxation, the big lie that trickle-down economics was coming from Reagan, and that impacts every single person still in the US in the bottom 90%. So these altogether, just from the change of economy, the loss of national identity, and that kind of racial anxiety, the great replacement theory, the changing of media narratives and the liberation of media access to people led to people falling out of democracies more and more. And whereas in the 1930s, or people born in the 1930s, 71% of the people thought that living in a democracy is important, people who were born in 1980s are only 29% of them say that it's important to live in a democracy. So these reasons together constitute that kind of change and shift in our way of looking at democracies. So we took a look at what populism is. We took a look at what liberal democracy is and how it can be undemocratic and how it can be liberal, as we saw with the dismantling of liberal institutions. And we also saw that the reasons for why populism is growing have to do with democratic deconsolidation. That is a sentiment and an overall shift in perspective that was caused in factor by struggling economies and lack of growth, the immigration policies from the liberal, and also the growth of media and that kind of growth in contenders. So the last part that I want to briefly touch before ending the live stream is what can be done about populism at this stage. Well, there are a few things to do, and none of them are too easy, and we also see that it may not happen. So one of the things is separating money from politics. As we saw with the lobbyism, as long as the political elites are making decisions that are not representing the popular will and are not crafting policies to help the people who are their constituents, but rather are influenced by the money flowing in from lobbyists and other forms of sort of financial incentives, as long as it is so, populism is going to stay. Very interestingly, I didn't know that, but there is a For the People Act. Lawrence Lessig is talking about this very optimistically on the Joe Rogan Experience. Nancy Pelosi, I think in 2018 or 2019, introduced the For the People Act, which was supposed to equalize the playing field when it came to gerrymandering in districts throughout the US, which was supposed to regulate lobbying, the amount of money that one can give to political parties. And overall, what's important is that this bill didn't make it through Senate. At that time, in a Republican minority, it didn't go through because they invoked the filibuster, meaning that it didn't go into action. It's very interesting that it's coming from Nancy Pelosi. So step one, politics needs to separate money from politics. As another step, countries should spend more on a particular part of welfare, which they don't really like spending too much on because it doesn't win elections, because it's not really sexy, which is research and education. One of the ways to combat stagnating growth in economies and the growing inequality would be to increase productivity, and not just through AI and corporate interest. But this has been the part of the trickle-down economics pushed by Reagan, which was that by enabling the highest performers and cutting their taxes, it's going to trickle down overall through economic growth to everybody, which was not the case. So instead of that, government who really want to battle or combat populism should invest into productivity. And the way you can do that is investing more into research and more into education, secondary education, tertiary education, making sure that the people have the ability to increase their skills and learn new things and become meaningful elements of society. The reason it is very important also has to do with identity. I'm not sure if I added it here. Probably not. But people in the 80s were more likely to define themselves as a part of a working class. They said, well, I'm a plumber or I'm a factory worker. In the Rust Belt, for example, this was a big part of people's identity in the US. When they lost these jobs and through globalization and just other business interests, they more and more started identifying themselves according to racial groups. So their identity shifted from the work they did, which they likely felt that it was meaningful to them, to things like, well, I'm a white male in Michigan. And that doesn't help with the anti-immigration sentiment most people feel, because the more likely people are to identify with their race instead of the kind of meaning in their life, the more likely the tensions are going to raise racially when immigrants are going to take jobs where people will perceive those jobs to be taken away from them. So this is going to come to the next stage, which is a level-headed solution for immigration. As for example, Yascha Mounk posits in the book, and I think this is a very reasonable ask from liberal governments, is that immigration should be something that's regulated. There is a logical need for border policies, who people are letting into their countries. Without this, countries will not only get the best of the people trying to immigrate into one country, but also people who don't necessarily want to integrate into that society. And that is going to cause tensions, that is going to cause criminality, that is going to cause public and internal conflicts within the state, where people will start scapegoating these minorities without regards to like whether they are meaningful parts of the society or not, because they will be seen as outsiders versus white people in America or in Germany. The liberals and the left overall should start addressing the rightful grievances of the people. They need to talk about the problems. This is one way of combating populists. For example, what Trump does really well is overloading the media with troll things. And the left, instead of talking about the problems that people are actually interested in, they just attack Trump. And the more they attack Trump, the more Trump gains in power from the people, because it will show to the people that, wow, these people, the elites, are really battling our candidate who wants to get rid of them. And they don't see it as an attempt by the liberals or the left to sort of save them from Trump's misaligned policies with people's interests, but rather as an attempt to bring down a democratically elected president. And by addressing the rightful grievances, I would say that the liberals and the left overall, should start looking at the bottom of the Maslow pyramid. For a long time, once democracies have been thought to be consolidated, they were already talking about a utopia, about green deals and tackling climate change and making sure that people are starting to work less, that you don't have to work 5 days a week, and you don't have to work 8 hours a day. people and like the political elites started disregarding the very realistic problems of people living in the bottom, people who don't have, or people who don't know what kind of food they're going to get tomorrow or how they're going to get food on the table. And before addressing those, we're not going to be able to talk about self-actualization on top of the Maslow pyramid. People are not going to be philosophers and painters and artists before they know what comes onto the table. And an element of that is to reduce the gap between the elites and the people, which goes back to increasing productivity, investing into welfare, separating money from politics, and so on and so on. Raising the taxes is definitely one of the elements to combat the inequality if the liberals, but also Republicans, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to do with political leaning. People who want to create a better democracy eventually will have to raise taxes, because what happens when you cut taxes is that typically on the other end of that equation, you have to cut spending. And the way spending gets cut is taking a look at welfare and cutting things that you consider not really important. And here is an excerpt of the book, which I think is really important. So we already talked about how Reagan slashed the top tax rate for high-income earners. But on the other end, the way he started cutting the expenses was he held funding for rent subsidies and public housing and kicked 1 million people off food stamps. Bill Clinton replaced aid to families with dependent children with temporary assistance for needy families. And now states have subsequently further eroded the system of social protection by redeploying the grants they receive from the federal government. Rather than providing the poor with cash aid or childcare, many of them now use these grants to fill holes in their budget. The aggregate impact of these changes has been huge. 2 decades ago, 68% of families with children in poverty received cash assistance via welfare. Today, that figure is 26%. Meaning that by cutting the taxes, somewhere you're going to cut parts of the welfare state. And this has happened in the US, this has happened throughout Europe as well, even though in Europe the taxes are a bit different. But in the US, this is big, and I don't see how Trump is going to cut less taxes or raise them, but rather they're going to cut spending, which is going to just lead to a sort of enshittification of the US as well, where the bottom 90% struggles more and more in the name of populist democracy. But yeah. The last 2 parts is, instead of focusing on the populists, the left should focus on the problems. We already talked about that. And the last part, which is pretty interesting, I think, is domesticating nationalism. So by abandoning nationalism after the Second World War, especially in Europe, nationalism after Nazi Germany was not something too desirable. People rather looked at it as a problematic element, and people looked towards a global meritocratic way of living, where liberalism also meant to dissolve the national heritage and the national and cultural identity so that it may not cause some troubles in the future. But the problem was that this vacuum was filled by the right. And by having this filled by the right, it meant that the left and the liberals got excluded from it. So if the left and liberals want to regain power over the populists, but there are left-wing populists to be fair as well, as mentioned, regardless of political leaning, if somebody wants to take back control from the populists, they will have to domesticate nationalism, so that it's not going to be as wild as it was before the Second World War and during the Second World War, but it's not going to be as mild and meaningless as after the Second World War. So people likely have to feel inclusive, regardless of political leaning, into their own nation without being excluded, being said that they're not the true people. This is something we see in Orban's Hungary, or what we saw in Kaczynski's Poland, that they claim to represent the true people, and everybody else is, highly likely of treason or committing treason. So overall, this was the live stream for today. I'll probably digest this into a more consumable video of like 14-15 minutes or so for next week. If you like this video and the live stream, like and subscribe. Otherwise, I hope to see you soon. Take care.